Okay, a quick word on the IOM report. This was the list of priorities IOM came out with. Number one priority, fascinating, interesting, and important, healthcare delivery systems. It certainly wasn't immediately obvious to me that that's where they would go, right? You might have expected them to list diseases, as they did after they got to delivery systems. So what are the priorities for the IOM? You might have expected they go to cardiovascular disease and mental health and musculoskeletal disease and cancer and on and on. But they said the most important thing is delivery systems. I think it's probably right. That is, if we really want to change practice, we want to understand what works, it probably makes sense to look first at delivery systems. However, that begs all kinds of evidence questions. Are we really talking about doing randomized trials of different delivery systems? Probably not. I mean, that's hard to do. It may be prohibitively expensive, and it begs all kinds of design questions about how you'd even do it. So it's not clear to me, at least, what it means to say delivery systems, except I think it's right in a broad way, and it begs a lot of questions, and maybe we can get to it in the discussion. So a couple of quick thoughts, and then I'll get to cost effectiveness and payment systems and stop. So my colleagues and I have been collecting data on CMS national coverage determinations, NCDs, since 1999. You can do this now because CMS posts its decision memos on its website, cms.gov. You can go and find it. So we've been collecting a lot of evidence, a lot of data on each decision. And one field, we have 30 fields or so we collect data on, is what evidence limitations did CMS cite? Okay, and what comes out of this, we published it, Sean Tunis and I, a few months ago. CMS is increasingly citing the fact that these technologies, and they're typically devices and procedures, there are a few Part B drugs in here, and diagnostics. They're citing the fact that they don't have relevant outcomes. We saw it in CT colonography, we've seen it in a lot of diagnostics, and they're citing that you're not applicable to the Medicare population. In other work, which I don't have here today, but we're analyzing and we'll be publishing in the future, CMS is truly tightening up its requirements. And while they say they don't use cost effectiveness, they will say publicly, where the budget impact is very large, we will look really carefully at the clinical evidence. And this slide shows it. And in recent years, it's become more and more difficult to get your technology through CMS coverage, national coverage. And even where they cover, they're covering with restrictions. They're covering with what they call evidence development, which means a narrow coverage determination and continuing to collect data. Okay, and they're doing it without, for the most part, cost effectiveness, with a few exceptions, which I'll get to. Okay, so the role of cost effectiveness analysis. Medicare was created in 1965, and the original statute says, Medicare will not cover items and services that are not reasonable and necessary for the treatment of illness and injury. So the words reasonable and necessary govern what Medicare does in terms of whether it covers or not. Now, nothing in Medicare statute says they can't use cost effectiveness. All it says is reasonable and necessary. So one could reasonably, I think, interpret the word reasonable to mean cost effective. And in fact, legal counsel at CMS has debated that quite a bit, and some have argued that they have the authority to do it, though they probably have to go through rulemaking. And at this late stage, given that they've never done it, maybe they really would need statutory cover to do it. Nonetheless, CMS has danced around the word cost effectiveness and publicly have said, and it's even in a guidance now that they've issued, we don't use cost effectiveness. Sort of a silly statement in many ways, because every decision has resource implications. We've seen the budget projections, which are truly alarming. How could they not use cost effectiveness? Well, politically, it's still too sensitive to do. But the MIPA legislation that I mentioned seems to give them the authority to use cost effectiveness for prevention. It doesn't use the word cost effectiveness, but it does say Medicare can look at expenditure data and outcome data, and CMS has internally said, we can use cost effectiveness. They did it recently for HIV screening, which they covered. They did it probably for CT colonography. There was this debate about whether they did or not. They don't use it often to deny things, but they have used it to actually justify covering or to justify the conditions around coverage. So Bob mentioned this database, and here's the URL. I don't know if you could see it down there. It's just www.cearegistry.org. It's a publicly available, online, searchable database. All of these studies are in the form of original cost per quality analyses. So we've seen a tremendous increase over time in the number of studies published, and about 50% are pharmaceutical or device. Another 5–7% are diagnostics. Sometimes there's a combination, but you can go in and search on a disease area or anything else you like. We certainly are seeing more and more, any way you slice it, more and more cost-effectiveness information in the literature. Now, interestingly, these are all English language studies. Nonetheless, most of them are done in the US by US investigators. Even though people say, well, the US, we don't use cost effectiveness, they do that in the UK and elsewhere. There's a lot of action going on in the US. Some funded by industry, many funded by others, surprisingly perhaps, but funded by NIH or foundations and others. And the reason I think this is increasing is because it's influential, even in the US. It gets into the journals, it gets into the thought leaders, it gets into the clinical guidelines at times. Sometimes it's not explicit, but I think the information is out there and important. It does beg a question about whether this captures well what people value with medical technology and with your devices. So the project that we've been doing, supported by InHealth, is to really try to focus in on that question with respect to diagnostics. And the pushback on diagnostics and value, in part, has always been, if you do a traditional cost-effectiveness analysis, the way you value a diagnostic is only if the diagnostic leads to treatment consequences. You do a diagnostic, you learn something, and then you follow up accordingly, and you can model all of that out, because you usually don't have trial data. And our InHealth project is sort of motivated by the possibility, supported by some other small studies and maybe by, common sense, that people may value diagnostics even if they don't have treatment consequences. So you might value information from a test because it reassures you don't have a disease. You might value it because it reduces your uncertainty. Economists would call that ambiguity avoidance. You might value it because of a whole host of non-health reasons. You want to know because you'd live your life differently. You'd get your finances in order if you found out you had Alzheimer's disease. You'd, spend more time with your family. You travel more. You do different things, even if there's nothing you can do.